Somewhere among the vast mesas of northern Arizona, near one of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America, there is a rock. At first glance, there is nothing extraordinary about it. No gold, no monumental temple, no giant statue. Just weathered sandstone and a strange collection of figures carved into its surface. A large human-like figure stands to one side. From it extends a line. Then that line divides into two paths. Small figures appear along them. There are circles, short vertical marks, and what some people say looks unmistakably like a Christian cross. But according to one widely circulated interpretation, this is not simply ancient rock art. It is a warning about the arrival of outsiders, about humanity becoming divided, about technological power, about abandoning the natural world, and ultimately, about a future period, sometimes described as the purification. One path supposedly leads humanity toward survival. The other ends. If that interpretation is genuinely ancient, then this stone raises an extraordinary question. How could people centuries ago have imagined events that seem so familiar today? But there is another possibility, a much more uncomfortable one. What if the rock is old, but the story we have been told about it is much younger? What if what millions of people now call an ancient Hopi prophecy was shaped, expanded, perhaps even partially rewritten during the 20th century? Today on Curious Asia, we're going to examine both possibilities, not to prove a prophecy, not to dismiss one, but to find out what this stone can actually tell us. To understand the rock, we first need to understand the place around it. Oribe, also written Oribe, sits on Third Mesa within the Hopi homeland of northeastern Arizona. The Hopi tribe describes itself as a sovereign nation whose communities have maintained their culture, language, religion, and relationship with Hopitutsqua, their homeland, despite centuries of outside pressure. Oribe itself is extraordinary. National Park Service material identifies Oribe alongside places such as Acoma and Taos Pueblo as communities settled roughly 1,000 years ago. Other accounts place the development of Oribe around the 12th century, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in what is now the United States. Think about that for a moment. Before the United States existed, before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, before Europeans even knew that Arizona existed, people were already living here, growing corn, in an unforgiving desert, conducting ceremonies, passing stories from one generation to the next, and maintaining a worldview built around relationships between human beings, the land, and the spiritual world. For us at Curious Asia, there is something especially interesting about that. Across Asia, we often encounter places where archaeology, oral memory, religion, and history overlap. But there is an important lesson here. We should not force Hopi tradition into categories familiar to us. This is not an Asian story. It is not a European story. It belongs first to the Hopi people, and that becomes extremely important when outsiders begin interpreting sacred symbols. The petroglyph near Oribe that became popularly known as Prophecy Rock is often presented as a map of humanity's future. One common interpretation begins with the large figure on the left. It is frequently described as representing the Creator, or a spiritual figure connected to the instructions given to the Hopi. The figure is sometimes said to hold a bow. In popular retellings, the bow points toward an instruction to abandon warfare and follow a peaceful path. From this figure runs a horizontal line, and eventually, the line divides. Two paths, two possible futures. Descriptions published outside the Hopi community commonly portray one path as the way of balance, human beings maintaining humility, community, and harmony with the earth. The other is associated with increasing material power, technology, and separation from traditional teachings. But look carefully, because this is where something fascinating happens. A mark between the paths has sometimes been interpreted as representing the arrival of Europeans. Another symbol has been described as resembling a Christian cross. and figures farther along the design have been connected by different interpreters, with different stages in humanity's development. To believers in the prophecy, this creates an almost irresistible narrative. The Hopi were living in this region long before Europeans arrived. Then Europeans came. Christian missionaries followed. Industrial civilization expanded. Railroads crossed the west. Electric wires appeared. Highways were built. Airplanes crossed the sky. Human beings developed nuclear weapons. And today, modern civilization faces environmental problems on a planetary scale. Suddenly, those simple lines on the rock begin to look less simple. But there is a danger here. Once we already know history, it becomes very easy to look backward and find symbols that seem to predict it. A line becomes a highway. A shape becomes an airplane. A circle becomes a planet. A cross becomes Christianity. Are these interpretations genuinely preserved from before the events happened? Or are we matching old symbols to modern history after the fact? Remember that question, because later it changes this entire story. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where archaeology, indigenous history, and mystery collide, subscribe to Curious Asia. We don't want to tell you what to believe. We want to give you enough evidence to decide for yourself. And in this case, the evidence becomes much stranger from here. Prophecy Rock is only one piece of a much larger body of Hopi teachings that outsiders have grouped together under the label Hopi Prophecy. And here, we need to move carefully. Hopi religious tradition is complex. Different villages, clans, and ceremonial societies may preserve knowledge differently, and not all sacred information is intended for outsiders. Even anthropological literature has repeatedly acknowledged that Hopi people have strong reasons for restricting access to religious knowledge, particularly after generations of outsiders recording, publishing, and commercializing traditions that communities considered private. So, when you find a website claiming, "Here is the complete Hopi prophecy," you should immediately be cautious. There may be no single public document containing everything. What the outside world knows is fragmented. Some came from ethnographers, some from Hopi speakers, some from books, some from 20th century activists, and some may have been transformed as stories traveled from one person to another. Still, one theme appears repeatedly in public presentations of Hopi teaching. Human civilization moves through periods of moral imbalance and renewal. In the 20th century, Hopi traditionalist spokesman Thomas Banyasya became one of the best-known people carrying this message beyond the mesas. In 1992, Banyasya addressed an event at the United Nations during the International Year of the World's Indigenous People. His message spoke about previous worlds, humanity's responsibilities, sacred teachings, and the danger created when human beings abandon spiritual balance and respectful treatment of the earth. UN documentation from the period records Banyasya's participation, while surviving transcripts preserve the substance of the message he presented publicly. That matters, because this was not simply an anonymous internet prophecy. There really were Hopi traditionalist figures publicly warning modern society about where its choices could lead. And within popular retellings of these teachings appears the idea of a coming purification. Not necessarily the Hollywood-style destruction of Earth, but a crisis, a correction, a moment when humanity can no longer continue living in imbalance without consequences. You can probably see why the story became so powerful. Modern audiences look around and see climate change, pollution, war, nuclear weapons, resource depletion, social fragmentation, technological dependence. Then they encounter an indigenous tradition warning that a civilization obsessed with power while losing its relationship with the earth will eventually face consequences. The parallels feel almost too perfect. And then comes perhaps the most famous modern element associated with Hopi prophecy, the blue star Kachina. You may have seen the phrase online. According to popular versions, the appearance of the blue star Kachina signals the final stage before a great transformation and the ending of the present world. Some retellings connect this with a transition from a fourth world into a fifth. But this is precisely where we need to separate an interesting tradition from a historical certainty. The popular Blue Star Kachina narrative is disputed. Researchers examining the history of modern Hopi prophecy have questioned how old some of these highly specific formulations actually are, and references to the Blue Star narrative become much more visible in 20th century publications and later New Age culture. That does not mean Hopi traditions concerning world cycles are invented. It means something more complicated. Ancient traditions can be real, while modern descriptions of those traditions can still evolve. And that difference is crucial, because now we arrive at the biggest question of this video. DMLD. How much of the story attached to Prophecy Rock can we actually trace backward? Here is where this story stops being a mystery video and becomes an investigation. The physical petroglyph associated with Prophecy Rock exists. The wider Hopi tradition of sacred narratives, world cycles, and warnings about proper human conduct also unquestionably has deep cultural roots. But proving the age of a specific interpretation is much harder. Imagine finding an old painting. You can establish that the canvas is old. You might even establish that the paint is old. But if someone tells you this symbol predicts World War II, that is a separate claim. You have to determine when people first started saying it meant World War II. The same problem appears here. One of the most influential books ever published for Western audiences about Hopi religion was The Book of the Hopi, written by Frank Waters and published in the 1960s. It became enormously influential. For generations of outsiders, it shaped what Hopi spirituality was supposed to look like. But scholars and Hopi critics have challenged the book's authority. Scholar Armin W. Geertz, who studied Hopi prophecy extensively, criticized the way modern prophecy traditions had been presented and argued that prophecy could be continuously reinterpreted in response to changing historical circumstances. The problem extends beyond one book. Outsiders have repeatedly attached their own beliefs to Hopi spirituality. New Age movements, environmental groups, alternative history communities, apocalyptic movements, even stories that were widely promoted as genuine native prophecies have sometimes turned out to have much more recent origins. Modern reporting based on research into Hopi encounters with counterculture movements has documented how outside interpretations sometimes became so widespread that they began affecting what non-Hopi and even some younger Hopi believed about their own published history. That should make us cautious. But caution works in both directions. It would also be wrong to conclude, well, if 20th century versions changed, then the whole tradition must be fake. That is not what the evidence shows. The Hopi tribe itself describes a cultural relationship with its homeland, religion, and ceremonial responsibilities extending across many generations. Thomas Benicia was not a fictional internet personality. He was a real Hopi traditionalist spokesman who publicly carried messages about humanity, spiritual responsibility, and the environment during the 20th century. Old Oribi is real. Its extraordinary historical continuity is real. The cultural struggle between traditional ways and outside forces is very real. What remains difficult to establish is something much narrower. How old is every individual meaning now assigned to every individual mark on Prophecy Rock? And there is no simple answer. So perhaps the most responsible conclusion is this. The petroglyph is real. The tradition surrounding prophecy is real. But the precise age and historical continuity of the modern, line-by-line interpretation cannot simply be assumed. That may sound less exciting than saying, an ancient civilization predicted our entire future. But actually, I think it makes the story more interesting. Because prophecy does not have to function like a supernatural newspaper from the future. Sometimes, prophecy functions as a framework, a warning passed through generations. A way of looking at human behavior and asking, if we continue down this path, where does it end? And the people of Oribi would eventually face exactly that kind of choice. Not in some distant future, but in 1906. If you've watched our earlier Curious Asia episode about the 1906 split at Oribe, you already know what happened. At the beginning of the 20th century, Oribe was being pulled in two directions. One group was more willing to cooperate with American institutions and certain elements of Euro-American life. Traditionalists resisted outside control and assimilation, particularly government pressure over education and cultural change. These tensions did not exist in isolation. For everything's at R. In the 1890s, Hopi men from Oribe who resisted government policies were arrested, and 19 were eventually imprisoned on Alcatraz. The National Park Service preserves the story of those prisoners today, drawing in part on work connected to the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. The pressure did not disappear, and in 1906, Oribe finally fractured. Academic histories describe the division between Hopi traditionalists and progressives that culminated in the split, after which traditionalists established Hautevilla. Later movements also contributed to the development of Bakavi. This event is historically documented. The argument happened. The community divided. Families were separated. A village that had survived for centuries under extraordinary conditions could not escape the pressures of modernization and American assimilation policy. Now look again at Prophecy Rock. Two paths. One, associated in modern interpretation with preserving traditional balance. The other, associated with another way of living. And suddenly, 1906 looks hauntingly familiar. Some versions of the prophecy story connect internal Hopi divisions with warnings preserved in the rock and broader prophetic tradition. But we need to draw a very clear line. The Oribe split is historically documented. Its interpretation as the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy is not the same kind of historical fact. Those are two different claims, and confusing them would turn history into mythology. Yet the connection remains fascinating. Because even if Prophecy Rock never predicted the exact year, 1906, the fundamental problem represented by those two paths was real. Tradition versus assimilation. Restraint versus expansion. An old way of living versus the promises and costs of a technologically powerful society. In that sense, the stone does not need to predict an event. It only needs to describe a choice. And that choice did come, which leaves us with an uncomfortable question. If the warning was never really about predicting individual events, what if we have been asking the wrong question all along? Instead of asking, did the Hopi predict our future? Maybe we should ask, are we making the same choice they warned about? The mystery of Prophecy Rock is therefore not simply, did the Hopi see the future? The deeper mystery is this. How much of the message is ancient? How much was shaped by later generations? And how much does that distinction matter? If humanity is now facing the exact kind of choice the story describes, because somewhere on that stone are two paths, and in the popular interpretation, one of them continues, the other does not. Long pause. So, I want to leave you with one question. When you look at the world today, our technology, our wars, our relationship with nature, our endless demand for more, which path do you think humanity is actually following? Tell us in the comments. And if you want to understand why the community at the center of this story literally split apart in 1906, watch our episode on the Oribe split. That event is not prophecy. It is documented history. And once you know what happened there, Prophecy Rock becomes even more difficult to forget. Subscribe to Curious Asia for more stories where ancient traditions, archaeology, and history meet, and where the truth is usually more complicated than the legend.